Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Isabel Fry, and I would like to welcome you to this webinar that we are hosting, looking at the COVID-19 stimulus review and the maximum available resources. This is fascinating, well, for us fascinating, and that's why we're so pleased that you've joined us, a topic which really ventures from human rights to the question of economic policy and back again. We know that in our constitution, everybody has the right to social security as one of the socio-economic rights, but we also know that whenever we, as activists, seek to have these rights advanced, we're told by National Treasury and other arms of government that there are no available resources. In fact, that the fiscal envelope is as tight as it can be and that nothing more can be spent from that. Today, we have an investigation into what this really means. Duma Krugule and I undertook a study, and he will report on that. The initial inquiry was looking at the stimulus package of the South African government as part of a global study of countries in the South to look and see whether or not maximum available resources were put, sufficient stimulus was there to enable our country to recover. The findings of that will be exposed, and it's all embargoed until this minute, so nobody else knows about it. You'll see it here first. From that, we will then consider about the question of progressive realization of socio-economic rights and what that means. Following from this will be Professor Sandy Liebenberg from Stellenbosch University, and she'll be followed by Dr. Janelle van den Berg from the Human Rights Commission. Comrade Busi Sabeko will then follow one of the chief activist advocates for budget justice, and she'll be followed by Professor Philip Alton, who is of New York University and is a global leader in terms of looking and unpacking the question of progressive realization and available resources. One of the questions that we want to have teased out today is looking at maximum available resources. What does it mean for the fiscus? What does it also mean, however, for monetary policy? We know in South Africa, there's a running question around the independence of the Reserve Bank. So in this webinar, we're asking you to join as we hear from experts, unpack some of these questions to try and come up with some answers. And we're looking forward to at least another number of months of critical activism on this front. So thank you once again, Isabel Fry, Director of Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. And before I introduce you to the facilitator, I'd just like to encourage you to look at our website, www.spy.org.za, to look at some of the research that we've been doing, both addressing directly the issue of COVID, but also progressive realization. So right now, I'd like to call to the front Lelona Sibe, who is our researcher of our budget advocacy program here with InSpy, and she will be taking us through the program for the rest of this webinar. Thank you very much, Lelona.
Great, thank you so much, Isabel, and thank you for the introduction to the webinar and that very warm introduction of myself as well. I am Lelona Mplesibe, and I will be facilitating and moderating this webinar today. So just a few housekeeping things before we get started. Each speaker will have 15 minutes. That is safe for Isabel and Duma, who will be sharing that 15 minutes. And I will be giving each speaker a 2-minute warning before your time is up. And a very warm welcome to our audiences who are streaming on our social media pages, and for those who have joined us here on Zoom, very good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. Just to mention that questions will be are encouraged to be posted on our comments, on our comment section, and they will be read out during the course of the webinar. And to just please indicate who your question or comment is directed to. And then also just to gently remind everyone to just keep your mics and your video off while the speakers are presenting. This just limits the amount of noise and interruptions that they will be facing. Okay, and then without any further ado, I will then be introducing each speaker before they come up. This will give each speaker the time to just set up their presentations and to share their screens with us. And the first of the speakers is going to be Duma Kobule, accompanied by Isabel Fry, and their bios read as follows. Duma Kobule has spent more than 2 decades as a financial journalist, analyst, researcher, and advisor on issues of economic development and transformation. He worked for the Black Economic Empowerment Commission, chaired by President Cyril Ramaphosa, and was co-author of the Commission's landmark report, which paved the way for the country's current Black economic empowerment laws and policies. And joining Duma Kobule is Isabel Fry, who is the founding director of Studies on Poverty and Inequality Institute in Johannesburg. SPI undertakes both primary and secondary research into poverty and social exclusions and policy analysis in the field of anti-poverty policies, inequalities, socioeconomic and constitutional rights, and social protection. She is a national minimum wage commissioner and frequent media analyst on issues of poverty, inequality, and social justice. Right, and I will then yield the floor to Duma Kobule and Isabel Fry. Thank you very much.
Windows. Thank you, Lilona. Can everyone see me? I can't see myself. It's a bit odd. Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you. We can see you, Duma.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I just have to say, I always get amazed at how, life, the twists and turns in life. When I arrived at university in Scotland as a teenager, like most teenagers, I had no clue what I wanted to do. And one of the courses I did was accountancy. And I really didn't like it, but I finished the course, first year accounting course. And I've never regretted that because it's become very useful later in life as I analyzed the balance sheet of Eskom. The other course I did was law. And there was a Ugandan lecturer in Scotland, and I didn't last the first semester. So now, many years later, I'm sitting here with so many lawyers studying the intersection between economics and law. And I have to confess, I'm a newcomer to this debate. It started literally a couple of months ago. There was a watershed moment for me when I was following the Home Fees Must Fall protest at the beginning of the year. And there was a watershed moment for me when the government and the police shot Moses in Tumba. And Tumba, yes. And what became obvious to me is that what the Treasury was trying to do by reducing first-year enrollments was definitely unconstitutional in terms of the defunding of NSFAS. So that is how I became involved in this, and I'm very passionate about it. I'm very happy to share with so many people. Can we move on into the slide here? So as Isabel was saying, this is part of a report by the Financial Transparency Coalition, a network of international NGOs who are working to curb illicit financial flows and promote a transparent financial system. This is a research project to track the effectiveness of economic responses and the impacts on the impact of COVID-19 in the global south. And there were 9 countries that were selected. The report is being launched today, I think in London. It's called Towards a People's Recovery, Tracking Fiscal and Social Protection Responses to COVID-19 in the global south. So in terms of the findings, the main finding was that a staggering 63% of pandemic-related funds went on average to big corporates, 8 out of 9 countries. Indian response was more balanced, partly, the next slide please, partly due to new definition of small business. In Kenya, 92% of funds went to big corporates. Guatemala was the only country where they spent more on social protection than other categories. In South Africa, the original stimulus announced by the president, only 10% went to the poor households and grants, and the expenditure on companies was 5 times more than what was spent for the poorest of the poor in grants. But if we looked at what was actually spent, 3 times more went to companies than was spent on social grants. Next slide. So the report starts off with an overview. We look at the crisis before the crisis, including the 2020 budget. We look at the president's stimulus announcement, supplementary budget, the economic reconstruction and recovery plan, the medium-term budget policy statement. It was a very busy year to analysts of the economy last year. Busi and I, who's in this panel, we were on so many panels together. She became like a professional partner of mine in all these panels where we discussed 5 things. And the 2022 budget. So we also did an analysis of social security spend in 4 categories: tertiary and basic education, health and social development, which accounted for 53% of spend. So the social spending in terms of the budget is that there were budget cuts of 136.2 billion in 4 categories. 24.6 in tertiary education, the largest cut of any percentage terms than any government department. It was 26% of the tertiary education budget, and I believe that it will collapse the system. There were 25 billion rand cuts in basic education. The Treasury itself conceded that it would result in fewer teachers, larger class sizes, and worse learning outcomes. There were cuts of 50.3 billion in health, 5.5 decline in real per capita spending over the next 3 years, and there was a 36% social grants. The next slide. So now this is the original stimulus package spending item that was announced by the president on the 21st of April. So there was a 500 billion rand stimulus package. There was above the line spending, 100 billion rands on job creation, tax measures of 70, social grants of 50, health of 20, municipalities of 20, and the total spend above the line on the budget was 240 billion rands. Below the line was the loan guarantee scheme, 200 billion. Unemployment insurance fund was, sorry, that's a mistake. The unemployment insurance fund was 40 billion, and the total was 260 billion. So this is how the package, as was announced by the president, is. Our report went through the smoke and mirrors of this, and we explained how National Treasury effectively cancelled the stimulus. And this is the real stimulus. A stimulus is new money that is injected into the economy. So what we do here, we calculate the real stimulus. So let's start with above the line on the budget. After all that government has said, the increase in non-interest expenditure in the latest budget, these are new figures that came out with the budget, was 34.6 billion rands. And the tax measures were not 70 billion rands. Sorry, the government was allowed to spend 140 initially, and they ended up spending 34.6. They canceled the stimulus. The tax measures were not 70 billion, they were 12 billion. So the total government response was 46.6 billion, 0.9% of GDP. The loan guarantee scheme wasn't 200, or now below the line, 200 billion rands. The banks only lent 18.2 billion rands. There was one success in the stimulus package. It was the unemployment insurance fund. And from the beginning of the crisis, I was talking to people at the fund trying to understand what is happening. There was discussion that the UIF would run out of funds. Obviously, I knew that was rubbish because the UIF had a huge surplus that it could not possibly run out of. So the UIF has spent 58.7 billion rands, and the total below the line spending was 76.9 billion rands, 1.5%. So the total stimulus was 123.5 billion rands, which is a quarter of the 500 billion that the president talked about, and that is only 2.5%. So we can move on to the next slide. So basically, the finance minister says the 2021 budget was not a stimulus budget, but every page in the 250 pages of the budget review talks about stimulus and consolidation, and fiscal consolidation and austerity. So this slide just shows an overview of the main budget. The third line, you see that there was an increase in non-interest spending this year of 34.6 billion, but there will be austerity measures over the next 3 years to withdraw 265 billion rands from the economy. And the real increase in non-interest spending will be about 4.4%, about 3.9% a year over the next 3 years. So that will impede the recovery. And that is the overview, the snapshot of the budget. The next slide, please. Yeah. So this is the overview on social spending. I won't really go into detail there, but what we looked at is the spending on tertiary, basic, health, social development. So the total spending over the medium-term framework is about 2.5 trillion, and social spending will decline every year for the next 3 years in terms of social spending and the envelope. Thanks a lot. The next slide, please. So this is a slide that we showed earlier on. It's basically a summary of what happened in social spending. So I won't go through it again, and we'll go on to the next slide, please. Yeah. So the conclusion is that our stimulus was 123.5 billion. It was 2.5 billion percentage of GDP. The world stimulus packages, by comparison, was $16 trillion, 17% of GDP. The SA state contribution was 0.9% of GDP. The world stimulus packages, the direct state contribution was 10 trillion, 10.6% of GDP. So every major developed and developing countries decided to inject new money into the economy. They borrowed, and central banks financed a large portion of this. I ask, why should it be different for South Africa? What makes us special that we think by withdrawing 265 billion rands out of the economy, we will have a better outcome? Our debt is not high by international standards. Every country had the same shock to GDP and tax revenues. In relative terms, we are where we were before the crisis. So as I asked, why should we be different? What does MAR mean in this context? In this context, it means that we must harness our public money, our sovereign currency, as Stephanie Kelton, the MMT celebrity economist, says. We must look at our so the central bank, the Reserve Bank, can finance a government response. They can do it at no cost. They can also do it on favorable terms. We have to look at the entire SA Inc. balance sheet. The PIC has assets of 2.2 trillion, and it's also got 800 billion rands in forex exchange reserves. But we go into very much detail in the report and explain alternatives into how we can finance a proper response. How the most urgent thing that we need to do as a South African economy now is to end this austerity and finance a meaningful injection of new money into the economy. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Next slide. So as you can see, the report is something that all of you should read with a bit more time than we have in our presentation. The first part of the report that Duma has just presented was an unpacking of the stimulus and this real story behind the smoke and mirrors. And then the second part, we start moving into the question of progressive realization. Many of you will know this, but I'll just talk to the main principles of progressive realization, which underline the socioeconomic rights in our constitution as a means to redress the horrors of the past and move towards a healed and full democracy. So looking at progressive realization, the state is meant to expand access to the rights over time towards universal enjoyment. As we say in our SPY three-stage methodology that we've developed to look at progressive realization, that needs to include access, adequacy, and quality, or the rights as the state makes more resources available. This is certainly not an excuse for the state to stagnate the rollout at any given level. In South Africa, we know that our socioeconomic rights are justiciable, and a proud lineage of constitutional court judgments have developed our jurisprudence in this regard. Slide. So looking at the monitoring really, really briefly, we all know that it's a lot more difficult to monitor progressive realization than it is to monitor negative rights violations. At one stage in South Africa, we had the dilemma where the Minister of Finance announced that greater children in terms of headcount would be included under the child support grant, but the value of the grant remained the same over 2 years, in other words, eroding the purchasing power. Now, is this a question of progress or regress? And in order to address that, we developed a three-stage monitoring tool, which is very similar to the Center for Economic and Social Rights in New York's OPERA tool, but it includes a policy review. Does the state commit itself to universal enjoyment within a reasonable time? We look at a budget review. Does Treasury make available resources sufficient to meet these programs? And then finally, we developed an indicator index, which we linked to Stats SA data sets, because there's no point in having indicators if you don't have data, to look at access, which is headcount and affordability, adequacy, does it meet basic needs, and the quality of the provision. Next slide. So as I move to conclusion at a breakneck speed, I just want to share, and our report spends a bit more time going into this, as does Professor Liebenberg, who will follow me in terms of presentation. The United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights handed down on the 29th of November 2018, concluding observations and recommendations to the South African state on some of the breaches or failures to meet progressively the realization of rights. And 3 quotes, which we think are quite pertinent to the question that we ask ourselves now is, firstly, the persistence of such inequalities signals that the model of economic development pursued by the state party remains insufficiently inclusive. In other words, we need to look at the big picture. Secondly, fiscal, i.e. tax policy, does not enable it to mobilize the resources required to reduce such inequalities. So we are not out of the starting gates. And thirdly, the fiscal policy, particularly as it relates to personal and corporate income taxes, capital gains and transaction taxes, inheritance tax and property tax, does not enable it to mobilize the resources required to reduce such inequalities. And it is not sufficiently progressive in that regard, which is what the Budget Justice Coalition and others have been arguing. So my final slide, we conclude in the report that after 27 years of failed economic policies, the time must be here for South Africa to re-examine its growth model to move towards a more inclusive developmental pathway. The current growth model has resulted in self-imposed constraints relating to the options available to using maximum available resources to mobilize resources. Thank you very much. Over to you, Lalona.
Great. Thank you so much to Isabel and to Uduma for that great presentation. It's given us a lot to chew on. Right, so then that takes us to our next speaker, who is Professor Sandra Liebenberg. So Professor Liebenberg is the Oppenheimer Chair in Human Rights Law and Distinguished Professor in the Faculty of Law, the University of Stellenbosch. She has been involved in research, teaching, public interest litigation, and advocacy in the area of socio-economic rights for a number of years. Now, I know that many of us in the chats as well as on Facebook Live, we probably know by now that this is a very distinguished panel of guests, and just welcoming Professor Sandra Liebenberg, and to just beam your presentation if you will be presenting with us. So I then yield the floor to you, and just also a reminder to our audience here on Zoom as well as on Facebook that if you have any comments or questions, please do just drop them into the chat boxes and in the comment section if you're on Facebook, and we will then read them out and direct them to the specific speakers at the end of the webinar. Over to you, Prof.
Thanks very much, Lalona, and good afternoon to everyone. So this is a really important webinar bringing together the economics and the human rights and law discourses. And the Studies for Poverty and Inequality asked me to speak particularly to whether the doctrine of retrogressive measures in international law and to a greater extent, increasingly greater extent, under the South African Constitution could be a tool for challenging some of these austerity measures that Duma and Isabel have outlined in their presentation. So just to start with a few basic points of departure, that the rights that Isabel spoke about in our Constitution, without the resources to back them up, are essentially paper tigers. They really do not mean anything. And we know that the COVID pandemic has really tracked the inequalities of race and gender from the colonial apartheid legacy and has only served to deepen these inequalities and divisions. The various relief programs and the 500 billion rand, which as Duma has explained to us is in fact 123 billion rand rescue package of April last year, has cushioned some of the impacts, but it won't really disrupt poverty and structural inequality. Already, it seemed that South African government was embarked in a program of fiscal consolidation or austerity budgeting in the lead up to the pandemic. And it seems that in the last 2 years, in all the budgetary moments that Duma put up on the screen and the fiscal policies adopted, that it has only entrenched and accelerated this program. And it goes without saying to this audience that these policies that leave in place this type of inequality and poverty present a profound crisis for the legitimacy of our constitutional project. So what is the doctrine of non-retrogression? Well, I'll come to explain it a bit, but just to mention that it forms a core part of the doctrine on socioeconomic rights under international and regional human rights treaties, and is increasingly also recognized under the South African Constitution. My presentation is focusing on the question whether it is a useful tool that we can use to challenge fiscal austerity measures through legislative and policy advocacy and ultimately through litigation. Now, just to mention the synergies between our Constitution and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which South Africa ratified, which means that it formally took on international obligations imposed by this treaty, and our own constitution, which drew much of its inspiration in terms of socioeconomic rights from this landmark international human rights treaty devoted to economic, social, and cultural rights. And the key concepts in the International Covenant are in economic, social, and cultural rights is that all the rights impose a basic floor, so-called minimum core obligations, which serve as a floor for the progressive realization of the rights to their real full fulfillment in all their dimensions of adequacy, so that they can ensure a life of human dignity to all. The covenant also requires that the maximum of available resources be used by state parties to realize these rights. And I think a point that is often missed in thinking about concepts such as progressive realization and maximum available resources is that these are shields for the state to basically ward off any claims for the realization of socioeconomic rights. But it's important to realize that they also impose concrete duties on states to show measurable progress in improving access to and quality of the rights, and also to show that they are mobilizing their full resource potential towards these priority duties. So it's both a shield and a sword. Now, what are the concepts of retrogressive measures and the doctrine of non-retrogression? Well, firstly, this refers to measures that cut back on previous levels of socioeconomic rights realization. So essentially, it's the converse of progressive realization. And these measures are usually adopted during times of financial or other crises when fiscal consolidation measures are adopted, which cut back on social budgets. Now, the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, early on, when Philip Alston, who's going to speak to us later in today's presentation, the committee stated in a general comment, of which he was the chair, that the doctrine of progressive realization means that retrogressive measures are prima facie incompatible with the duty of progressive realization. They can only be adopted when the state can fully justify them, and the state has a strong burden of justification to say why it's adopting such measures and to justify them. Now, the criteria for this justification was developed by the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, particularly in the wake of the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And the committee essentially held in a number of instruments and in its reviews of state reports that a set of substantive and procedural duties are associated with this duty. So the state has to show, for example, that these measures are really justified by the circumstances of crisis, that they're necessary, that they're proportional in the sense that all other reasonable alternatives were explored and were exhausted before adopting measures which can cut back on rights enjoyment. Also, the committee is extremely concerned that the inequalities which international evidence tell us grow in times of fiscal austerity should be combated. So such measures should not result in any direct or indirect discriminatory impact. They should not lead to a sustained backsliding in the realization of the rights, and at all stages, a basic social protection floor, or so-called minimum core obligations, should be maintained. And then the committee also puts a lot of emphasis on participatory measures, such that before the measures are adopted, there is genuine participation by affected groups, and that there are independent review mechanisms of such fiscal consolidation programs. Now, as I've already mentioned, already in the lead up and prior to COVID, when South Africa was being reviewed by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in 2018 under the Covenant, a number of NGOs submitted evidence that in fact real per capita spending on social services was declining, particularly in areas of health, education, and social security. The committee was convinced by these arguments, and in its report called Concluding Observations, adopted in November 2018, it expressed concern about the real decline in social spending, that there was no clear time frame for re-examining and lifting these measures, and that these measures also came in a context where the Auditor General was identifying a number of cases of irregular, fruitless and wasteful expenditure and mismanagement of state-owned enterprises. And the committee made a number of recommendations to South Africa, including that it increase its level of social spending and that it charged key institutions in the executive and in parliaments at national and provincial level to ensure that human rights are taken into account in budgetary processes. And it reminded South Africa of the justificatory criteria for retrogressive measures that I have described. The committee made detailed recommendations to South Africa, and I'm not going to run through all of them, but perhaps as a scene setting also for this webinar, just to mention in the specific sphere of social security, that the committee was extremely concerned about the gap in social security provisioning between the ages of 18 and 59 for impoverished people who did not qualify for one of the other social grants. And it also called upon South Africa to consider the possibility of introducing a basic income grant. And we might want to pick up on that in the discussion that follows. Now, I mentioned that there is evidence that the doctrine of retrogressive measures is also finding some traction, not just international law, but also in South African domestic law. So, for example, in the famous old Grootboom decision on right to housing, the Constitutional Court accepted that our doctrine of progressive realization and the committee's doctrine of retrogressive measures have a similar meaning and could be used to interpret the socioeconomic rights in sections 26 and 27 of our Constitution. Also last year, during the COVID pandemic, the doctrine of retrogressive measures was relied on quite substantially in the reasoning of the North Gauteng High Court in finding that the suspension of the National School Nutrition Program was inconsistent with the right of children to basic nutrition and to basic education, because hungry children obviously can't learn properly. And it was also cited by the High Court in a case which held that the cutting back of the subsidy to NGOs providing early childhood development services by provinces was unconstitutional.
2 minutes remaining, Prof.
Thanks so much. So our courts have also accepted the two quotes that I've just put up there, that resources can't just be an automatic defense, that they need to be justified, how resources have been prioritized and are they aligned properly to constitutional priorities. But if one would think about bringing, for example, a direct challenge to the budget or to macroeconomic policy, even on the basis of retrogressive measures, one can envisage a number of problems being experienced. So I've just highlighted 3 measures here, which we can pick up on in discussion. For example, will the courts accept that a reduced budget in and of itself will have a retrogressive impact on rights enjoyment, or will they require some kind of manifestation of that reduced enjoyment in practice? And I've been doing some work on this issue in my recent scholarship. What kind of evidence will a court need to prove the retrogressive impact of budgetary austerity measures? But I think most importantly is this huge question of the court's own perception of their institutional role and their scheme within the separation of powers doctrine, you know, being not to upset the budgetary and macroeconomic apple cart, and being also very concerned about so-called polycentricity, where they can't foresee what the impact of their interventions in the budgetary decision making in one area will have in other areas of economic and budgetary policy. So a direct frontal challenge to the budget in the court, I would never say it's impossible, but I think there are substantial challenges that will have to be met. However, I think there are other, and I'm wrapping up now, avenues that can be explored, particularly through involving the Chapter 9 institutions and civil society advocacy. So I think, for example, drawing on the UN guiding principles on human rights impact assessments of economic reforms can be a very useful tool in terms of us insisting that Treasury and that parliaments, etc., conduct a proper human rights-based impact assessment. I think the role of public participation in this sphere could be greatly strengthened. The Open Budget Survey has said while South Africa ranks highly in terms of the transparency of its budgetary processes, in terms of public participation, it ranks low. And there are a range of international sources and tools that can be drawn on, particularly also given that Parliament now has some amendment powers with regard to the budget and fiscal frameworks. Another suggestion would be for the South African Human Rights Commission. It has a specific mandate to monitor and seek information on socioeconomic rights from organs of state in terms of Section 184, subsection 3 of the Constitution, and there's no reason why this specific mandate can't be used to request information and to interrogate Treasury, for example, on its budgetary and fiscal decision-making processes. And then exactly what SPY and others are doing, the role of media and civil society advocacy in developing alternative economic frameworks. So thanks, Lilona. I think ultimately I've made my point that the key issue is how to ensure that human rights are properly factored into macroeconomic and budgetary decision making. And I hope I've shown that the doctrine of retrogressive measures can provide a useful set of tools for interrogating austerity measures. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much to Professor Sandra Liebenberg. That was very comprehensive, and it showed a very clear link from the socioeconomic rights and the development of policy that protects said rights, which is very constitutional and very democratic in our nation. So thank you very much for that. You took me back to my law class back at university. So it's a very, very well done presentation. Thank you so much. I will then move on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Chanel van der Berg. And just to give you a brief, a brief bio on the Dr. Chanel van der Berg. She currently holds the position of senior researcher at the Equality at the South African Human Rights Commission. She has also acted as head of research at various times since 2018 and served as deputy information officer from 2018 until 2021. Her research focuses on horizontal and vertical equality, equality in the enjoyment of socioeconomic rights, sustainable development, access to information, land, and business and human rights. That is a very expansive bio, and I will then yield the floor to you, Dr. Chanel van der Berg, and to just get your presentation beamed up. And in the meantime, just want to say the comments on Facebook are welcome and recorded, and as well as the questions in our live chat room. Just to note that these questions will be recorded, and if we do have time at the end, then maybe there is a discussion that might ensue, but these questions will be documented, and in the later release of the report will be noted and addressed. So then I hand over to you, Dr. Chanel van der Berg. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Linola, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to SPI for this important panel. So today I'll be speaking about the state's human rights obligations in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, bearing in mind the obligation to marshal the maximum extent of its available resources to do so. So as we all know and we've heard already, even prior to the pandemic, South Africa faced these crises of widespread poverty and gross inequality. So despite our progressive and unique constitution with justiciable socioeconomic rights, poverty remains intractable. And it's worth bearing in mind, referring to Isabel and Duma's presentation, that even if we were to completely eradicate poverty, inequality, or at least vertical economic inequality, would remain. And we would still see this gross concentration of wealth at the top 1% and 10% of South African society. So this led the Commission through research in 2018 in its Equality Report to note that radical socioeconomic transformation might require us as a collective to focus on this extreme concentration of wealth at the top. And to do this, one must necessarily look at the human rights compliance of fiscal and monetary policy. So in that 2018 report, there's one recommendation. It's an advisory recommendation pertaining to VAT and the VAT increase, but it also looks at the possibilities of looking at the taxation system. And in this regard, it relies on the work of Philip Alston in his capacity as Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty. So as we've heard already today, it's by now tried that globally, the pandemic has exacerbated both poverty and then inequality as well. And in South Africa, given our legal framework, these manifestations of poverty and inequality will often amount to a violation of constitutional rights. So in terms of our constitutional framework, the declaration of a national disaster does not affect any of the human rights guarantees in the Bill of Rights. Only the declaration of a state of emergency would invoke the derogations clause in the Constitution. So we all have all our rights, and if government's fiscal and economic choices result in a violation of these rights, then or an infringement, then that would have to be justified in terms of the limitations clause that's in Section 36 of our Constitution. So it would have to be reasonable and justifiable limitation in an open and democratic society based on freedom, dignity, and equality. But now we've got the added challenge that unfortunately, despite our progressive jurisprudence on socioeconomic rights, our courts have declined to apply the Section 36 limitation analysis to the positive qualified socioeconomic rights provisions in the Bill of Rights. So this whole two-stage process of determining what the right means, and then whether government has breached its obligations in terms of the right, are conflated into the Constitutional Court's model of reasonableness review. All right, so the constitutional rights of access to adequate housing, healthcare, sufficient food and water, and social assistance are all guaranteed to everyone. So as our Constitutional Court has held, this means that both the right and value of equality is invoked when we speak of socioeconomic rights. The state is obliged to adopt reasonable legislative and other measures within available resources to progressively realize each of these rights. And then the state, in addition, has immediate obligations when it comes to the right to human dignity and also the right to equality. Next slide, please. Oh no, previous slide, sorry. Yes, thank you. All right, so the question which arises there is whether the government's response to the pandemic is reasonable. And our Constitutional Court has held in Grootboom that for a program realizing socioeconomic rights to be reasonable, appropriate financial and human resources must be allocated towards achievement of that program. So this places an obligation on government, both in terms of the Constitution and the International Covenant, to constantly marshal resources to increase the resource envelope available or at its disposal to the maximum extent possible. And thereafter, to allocate and spend those resources efficiently and effectively. So as we've heard, the government measures adopted to respond to the pandemic are numerous and include the stimulus package and the TERS scheme, and then also the social relief of distress grant of 350 Rand per month. So I'll refer to this as the special COVID-19 grant. And since those who rely on this meager 350 Rand grant are the most destitute and vulnerable in our society, I will focus on this relief measure for purposes of today's discussion. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so this is the provision from the regulation which sets out the special COVID-19 grant. And it's been essential in mitigating hunger and addressing subsistence needs during the pandemic and the ensuing lockdown. So the eligibility requirements include being a citizen, a permanent resident or a refugee, registered with the Department of Home Affairs, and that no other social grant is being received. So this means that currently 2 vulnerable groups are excluded from receiving this COVID-19 grant. First being non-nationals with no or irregular migration status, and then the second being caregivers who are mostly women who receive the child support grant for the child in their care and not for themselves. So these vulnerable groups are left destitute without any form of social assistance to navigate the unfolding economic repercussions of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So the exclusion pertaining to non-nationals was to a certain extent successfully challenged by the Celebrity Centre of Cape Town. And so now the COVID-19 grant can also be received by special permit holders and asylum seekers. But as mentioned, non-nationals with no immigration status or with irregular immigration status are still excluded. And this is despite the fact that this regulation on the screen, Regulation 9 under the Social Security Act, makes provision for expanding the pool of beneficiaries. And as you can see there, okay, so we see the same eligibility requirements in subsection 1, but then subsection 5 clearly states, notwithstanding the provisions in sub-regulation 1, that social assistance can be expanded to benefit households that are affected by a disaster in terms of the Disaster Management Act. So we clearly have the regulatory basis to extend this grant. Next slide, please. Okay, so as already mentioned, these rights, including the right to social assistance, is granted to everyone. So immediately we have to think about the right to equality, and we have to think about the duty not to discriminate that's contained both in our Constitution and in the International Covenant. So in adjudicating these rights, the courts will apply a model of reasonableness review. Next slide, please. So in Grootboom, the Constitutional Court held that the state's housing program that was at issue in that case failed the reasonableness test due to the fact that it did not make provision for those in most desperate needs. So as you can see here, the court said there's no express provision to facilitate access to temporary relief for people who are living in intolerable conditions and for people who are in crisis because of natural disasters. These are people in desperate need. So in terms of Grootboom, the COVID-19 grant is unreasonable to the extent that it does not provide for the most vulnerable in our society, such as destitute, undocumented non-nationals, and women who receive the child support grant for the benefit of the child in their care and not in their own right or for their own subsistence needs. These exclusions may therefore be deemed to be unconstitutional to the extent that, according to curriculum, they must cater for the worst off in society, but they don't. So those in desperate need still do not even receive 350 Rand a month to purchase food and basic necessaries of life. Next slide, please. And then the CAUSA case is also very important when we think about the state's constitutional obligations, especially since this case dealt with permanent residents. So the court in CAUSA emphasized the implication of equality rights whenever we speak about social assistance or any socioeconomic right that's guaranteed to everybody. And the Constitutional Court also held, as per the quote on the screen, that context is very important in deciding whether a government's program is reasonable or not. So amongst other things, it looks at the purpose of the social assistance, the impact of the exclusion on, in this case, permanent residents, and then the relevance of the citizenship requirement. So in our instance now, as we sit in the pandemic, the purpose is to aid those who find themselves otherwise destitute, hungry, homeless, and so forth, due to the pandemic, the lockdown measures, and the global and local economic downturn. The exclusion has a direct impact on the right to the equal benefit and equal enjoyment of rights as guaranteed in Section 9, 1 and 2 of our Constitution. It has a direct impact on the right of access to sufficient food and water, and it has a direct impact on the right to human dignity and even the right to life. The criterion of citizenship is immaterial since non-nationals were essentially trapped in South Africa within its borders last year when the hard lockdown was imposed. So the contextual analysis shows that the impact of the exclusion is severe both for non-nationals and for women who receive the child support grant, but no grant for themselves. In the case of women and the lack of grant for them, this may also amount to unfair discrimination on the ground of gender in terms of the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. Next slide, please. All right, so as Professor Levenberg indicated, most of these cases will hinge on resource-based justifications and profit by the state. So limited or scarce resources are a reality, and courts and other supervisory bodies, including Chapter 9s, need to navigate within these constraints. But we do have some pointers. So, for example, in CAUSA, the court noted strongly that when life, dignity, and equality are implicated, this must be taken into account along with resource constraints. And here in the pandemic situation, these rights are squarely implicated. Then Professor Levenberg kindly indicated how in Blue Moonlight Properties, in that case, the Constitutional Court also interrogated budget defenses. Next slide, please. So the court in CAUSA said that even where the state may be able to justify not paying these benefits to everyone who is entitled to them in terms of our Constitution, because they can't afford to do so, then the grounds on which they limit this benefit or the allocation of resources must also be consistent with the Bill of Rights as a whole. And if these cuts or exclusions unreasonably limit other constitutional rights, that must be taken into account. And as I've mentioned, equality, human dignity, life, food and water, housing, it's all being limited by our current fiscal environment. Right, so ultimately then, the courts and supervisory organs would need to assume quite an active role in ensuring that the overall resource envelope available to the state to fulfill its socioeconomic rights obligations is sufficient. And that the overall, and here speaking to Duma's point, that the overall resource envelope results from reasonable policy choices. So, for example, if government was loath to approach international lending institutions for loans due to conditionalities, whatever the case might be, then that needs to be explained in the context of our Bill of Rights. So bailing out failing state-owned entities in the midst of a global and domestic crisis, or banning products that provide a large tax revenue, should feature in any inquiry as to whether government is acting reasonably by excluding certain vulnerable groups from very modest relief measures. Any evidence adduced by the state to justify its resource scarcity must be closely scrutinized to ensure that important rights at stake are respected, protected, and realized to the maximum extent of available resources. Now, a universal basic income grant would go a long way in bridging these egregious poverty gaps amongst the vulnerable, able-bodied adults in South Africa. And I think Isabel also spoke to that. So in conclusion, the state has a duty to act reasonably in achieving socioeconomic rights, including the right to social assistance. Since the right to equality, human dignity, and even life are implicated in this context of this crisis, the state must proffer very strong justificatory arguments for failing to realize the right of access to social assistance. The state is under constitutional and international law obligations to constantly marshal its resources and increase its envelope of available resources for purposes of fulfilling all its human rights obligations. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chanel van der Berg. That was a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. And I think that a lot of the questions in the discussion will stem from the information shared by you. And for that, we thank you. This is a very interesting and very thought-provoking, like I said, conversation and discussion to be had, which is why I think there's a deep appreciation for platforms such as this to air these questions and to put forward these findings in order to not only challenge, but also to engage with the state and with policymaking, and of course with civil society organizations that are interested and that are involved as stakeholders in these discussions. And speaking of stakeholders and interested parties, I will then introduce our next speaker, who is Ms. Busi Sibeko, who is an economist and researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice. Her current research focus is macroeconomic policy, including tax justice, fiscal and monetary policy, and participatory feminist budgeting to advance socioeconomic rights. All right, so as Busi gets her presentation ready for us this afternoon, yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of questions that hopefully these discussions can facilitate and can answer. You know, speaking to, you know, was the so-called stimulus package enough to save our economy? We see that in the previous or the most recent quarterly labor force survey, indicators that show a drastic decline in employment and in the economic stimulus for the last year since lockdown. And so these are questions that we really do need to be holding amongst ourselves. And with that, I think let me yield the floor to Busi. I hope you're ready with your presentation at this time.
Hi, I actually am waiting to be made co-host so that I can share my screen. So just...
Right. So if our Buzz team could just facilitate that, please.
Okay, seems to be all set. Good afternoon, and I've got the challenging role of speaking after all these wonderful inputs, but also the nice thing about it is that some of the areas I would have covered have already been covered, which gives me more space to talk about the things that interest me as well in this conversation. As already said, I'm Busi Sibeko. And yeah, wearing my hat here as the co-chair of the Budget Justice Coalition. So I think, you know, just to begin, I think it's always important to contextualize the conversation in terms of where we are. And I'm just going to set my timer so that I don't go over the 15 minutes, but to contextualize and say that the austerity measures that we're seeing now are an acceleration of measures that have been happening over time. And it's important that we recognize that and acknowledge that, because the damage that's being done now is just building on damage that's already been done, particularly to the poor, to the vulnerable, to the working class, that has happened over time in South Africa in terms of the fiscus itself in the last at least 5 years. So I wanted to start here and say, look, we've heard our finance minister say expenditure is increasing. And when you look on the graph on the left, it obviously has increased. But what we need to acknowledge there, and why this picture is important, is that even though our supposed expenditure is increasing, like there you can see the gap there, the infamous hippo, as our finance minister would say, the fastest growing expenditure item has been debt servicing costs. So the more important table for us today is to look to the right. And so non-interest spending is effectively all spend excluding debt servicing costs. So even though the total expenditure here is increasing, what has happened here is that non-interest expenditure, if you look here, the green, this is what's happening to non-interest expenditure, which is spending on everything but debt servicing costs. So what we can see from that graph, or at least what I'll share with you, is that between 2016, 2017 and 2018-19, the increase in the average non-interest expenditure basically was 0.9%, which is lower than 1.6% population growth. So what's been happening over time is that spend per person in South Africa has been declining. And obviously, depending on which department, you'll see that there's varying declines. So, and it's important to also acknowledge that inflation is different for various departments. For instance, with health, we know that medical price inflation is higher than normal, inflation that we experience on our goods, our food. So therefore the cuts there, or rather the declining spend per person, is actually more magnified there. So we saw, and we've already spoken about the VAT increase, which was a retrogressive measure, disproportionately impacts the poor more than others, and it reduces their disposable income. And there's just been, this is where we were before COVID, right? There was a collapse in public investment in South Africa, as I've already said. And it's very interesting now that infrastructure has become the key, focus. We're going to spend on infrastructure to get out of this current crisis. But then at the same time, it's important that we then question, why was it that prior to COVID, government was actually declining in its investment in infrastructure? So why the sudden change of mind? And I think critically, in thinking about this current moment, generally, we need to ask these inconsistencies. So I'm hoping as I go through my presentation, I'll highlight some of these inconsistencies. So infrastructure, not so important in 2016-17. Oh yeah, well, now there's COVID, now super important, but then of course, private sector led infrastructure development. So there you see learner spending has been decreasing for years, largely unnoticed, but per learner spending has been declining, and so forth. So that's where we were. And in fact, it's no surprise that the 500 billion, it was not 500 billion to begin with, because the decisions were being made from a theoretical understanding and a theoretical preference for austerity, right? So our 500 billion or rescue package was made from that perspective, right? Which means that obviously it was going to reflect some sort of austerity in it. And we couldn't have expected something different, because this is where our government's point of departure is. It's a neoliberal settlement. It's one that believes that austerity is the way to go. And so, not shocking. So you see there the principles for the 2021 medium-term expenditure framework. This budget is not surprising. They already said, we're going to cut the budget. We're going to have fiscal consolidation. We will not add additional resources to human rights effectively. We will not, this is where they're coming from, and that was clear beforehand. And Duma likely has gone through this, so I don't have to go through the scorecard. But effectively, the Institute for Economic Justice did an assessment of the package itself to see how much of it had been utilized just before the SONA, so that would have been February. and see that large portions of it haven't been utilized. And why this is important is because we cannot have a recovery if we do not have rescue. And we are currently in a moment where our government has decided that we no longer need rescue, and they've decided that we are now in recovery phase. But you can't recover if you have not rescued the economy. You can't recover if you haven't helped people, right? You haven't helped businesses, you haven't helped households. You are, what sort of recovery can we anticipate based on this failure to implement these measures? So I'll talk a bit about this budget. And I think a lot of this has already been discussed. The austerity budget withdraws the states from its constitutional responsibilities and continues South Africa on unequal development. And so it's really, this budget is a threat to human rights in South Africa. And, of course, we've covered retrogression and so forth. But I think importantly in this budget, it is clear that our state is saying, we don't have money. Right? They are giving us this argument that austerity has to be done, but at the same time, it's saying we're going to reduce corporate income tax. At the same time, it's saying we're going to give bigger breaks for the wealthier, really tax breaks for the wealthier. So again, this inconsistency, you cannot be in both sides. The state cannot say we don't have the resources, but at the same time be foregoing tax revenue on the other end of the coin. And so this budget is just deeply problematic in that way as well, right? In terms of the justifications for certain things. And I think also to highlight that this budget is premised on National Treasury winning the public sector wage bill court case. So it assumes in a way that they've already won. And so what happens here is that, then they've done all these cuts and assumed that they've already won, which is also another problematic role for the state to play, which assumes, right, that they've won against workers prior to even completing that entire process. And so what they've said is that if they lose, they're going to basically not allocate further funds, which means that, in fact, there's a bigger threat to this budget going forward because they will stick to the budget as it is. And so that is also a big threat that might actually materialize. But fundamentally, it is austerity is neoliberal dreams come true. It is the desire to shrink the role of the state. It is the desire to, put private sector as central. And I think this is clear in this whole budget. I mean, you just have to look at the GBVF, yes, plan, which is supposed to be private sector led. This whole budget is about how private sector, enabling the private sector to basically fill that role. It's about how do we remove the state so as to not crowd out the private sector. So it's really reproducing the economic settlement that's gotten us here to begin with, right? And I think to highlight there to say, part of the reason why we have this human rights crisis in South Africa is because we do not have an economic policy or economic framework that would deal with some of the issues that we face. So with the wrong economic model, you're going to reproduce these structural inequalities that we are seeing in socioeconomic rights, right? And so that's part of the real core of why we are seeing what we're seeing, and then how this budget is basically reinforcing that. But again, I won't go too much into this because I see I'm running out of time. But to say that, like I said, it's a very private sector led growth. And so then we have to ask ourselves, what is the role of the state? What must the state provide? And, our constitution is clear about what the role of the state is. But what happens when our national treasury says, we do not see this role for ourselves? In fact, we believe that private sector must provision these things. And so, we're going to see a rise in user pay principle, right? Minister Tito Mboweni has expressed in the past that he favors user pay, infrastructure. So what happens in a country like South Africa where people want high unemployment, more than half the population lives below the upper bound poverty line. Yet we've got a finance minister who wants to create infrastructure that would require people to then, pay for these services. And so it's really a critical question about what is the role of the state in publicly provisioning goods and services that, progress human rights. And so this is where we are. And I've said this in the past to say that we cannot be, again, the other inconsistency here is that there's a push for private-public partnerships where the government will basically, shoulder the liability for those loans. And I always say that you cannot be concerned about debt, but at the same time say, we are going to absorb, these risks for the private sector, and the private sector is the one that actually benefits more, because if a project fails, government will pay them. They're still going to get their outcome, and if they win and they do the project right, they still get the profits. So private sector, it's enabling private sector in many ways, and it's also a threat to our fiscus in a very real way. And so what happens when these companies fail? It means government will shoulder the costs, and then guess what? We're going to see more austerity, and we're going to see further, a decline in human rights delivery or realization in South Africa. So I won't go through too many of these, but I think this is an important graphic to see that per person expenditure and what's happening there. So obviously in 2019, 2020, you can see it increase, but that's obviously because of, spending due to the crisis itself.
Lucy, you have just 2 minutes remaining.
Yes, I'm looking at the screen here, I've got the timer. And so you'll see that over the next 3 years, there's like a rapid decline in expenditure per person per South African. And as already stated, there has been no human rights assessment of how this will impact actually human rights in South Africa. So very critical in our state when decisions are made about budget, yet there are no assessments. In fact, there's no assessment of the last 5 years and how cuts to budget over time have impacted people. And of course, we've got anecdotal evidence around what's happening. But really to say that the National Treasury in a way and the decisions being made here are very damaging to human rights in South Africa because it does not center human rights. Our fiscal policy in a way has been done in a way that does not center human rights. And this budget is clearly demonstrating that. I mean, I was talking to someone about cuts to the CCMA and how, there's no recognition of the demand, the growing demand that's going to be on CCMA services because of the current context and the pandemic and how people are losing their work. But at the same time, CCMA is being underfunded. And so, and cuts to the budget when CCMA has said continuously that they are functioning with a small budget and they're trying their best to meet the demand and that in fact they need more resources. So I'm going to, my last point to say that it's not about debt as a total amount. It's really about debt servicing costs. And in fact, austerity in itself is a threat to the maximization of resources, right? Because austerity is going to shrink our economy. Austerity is going to be detrimental to our economy. So in fact, you're going to end up in a vicious cycle where, we're going to come back here and say human rights are at risk and they're going to continue to do this. And so austerity is self-defeating during recessionary times because it multiplies the effect on the shrinking private sector as well. And so we need a stimulus, we need a different type of economic thinking, we need non-orthodox monetary policy options, we need to rebuild a different economy. I love someone's need to rebuild, reimagine in many ways. And to leave you with this last graphic, say, look what our South African Reserve Bank was able to do last year. If you look here, you see the repo rates and the government bonds. And if you see, you'll notice that SARB's interventions led to cheaper borrowing costs. And that is fundamental in terms of how we can think differently about debt and debt servicing costs, and that the tools exist for our government to implement different policy. And so I'll just leave it here. I think I've run out of time. But yeah, so it's debt servicing costs and not debt that we should be worried about.
Right. Thank you so much, Busi. I know that this discussion is very near and dear to your heart and we could speak all afternoon, but unfortunately we cannot. I do have to make space for our next and final speaker, who is Philip Alston, a professor of law at New York University and former UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights and former chairperson of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights for 8 years, spanning from 1991 to 1998. So over to you, Philip Alston. You do have some time, and right after your presentation, we will have a capturing of the questions, and then we will move on from there. So over to you, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Lilona. It's a great pleasure to be part of this discussion. It's been a very rich set of presentations from my point of view. Duma showed us the very effective budgetary sleight of hand, which is at work in terms of the various claims made by government compared to what's actually happened. I think Sandy and Chanel indicated, at least for me, what is really specific to South Africa about this, which is the transformative constitutional foundation for pursuing some of the legal approaches to making socioeconomic rights more salient and more relevant to what's actually going on. And then I particularly identified, I have to say, with Busi's presentation right now, which I think goes to the heart of the challenge. In some ways, the issue that I see, and that I'll come back to, is how we knit together some of these different perspectives, because we do all tend to operate in silos, even when we are well aware of the issues that others are working on and of their connection to what we are doing. But it's absolutely essential in this sort of context to be striving to make the connections and make things work in a more interactive and synthetic way. I think, as Busi said, what you've described is really a textbook case of the implementation of neoliberal policy. It's being done in a really impressive way. I'm sure that the terminology of neoliberalism is not present, but it's hard to see any element of the government strategy which doesn't fit absolutely perfectly. The reduction of taxes on both corporations and wealthy individuals is an extremely important element, because the whole idea is to hollow out the state budget to the greatest extent possible, thus making the private sector the only available option. The state, which is then really only left to play the role of facilitating the work of the private sector, is simply unable to take any of the measures that have been described in terms of economic and social rights. Indeed, in some ways, one might think this is a strategy inspired by the Covenant, in the sense that someone might have said, let's make sure that the maximum available resources are close to zero. In other words, let's get rid of state resources. Let's reduce the revenue that's coming in by cutting taxes. Let's reduce the footprint of the government. And then we can simply say, well, we don't have any resources, and we are using the maximum of those few that are in fact available. And obviously that's a huge problem. I want to just talk very briefly because it's eerily reminiscent for me of what I saw in the United Kingdom. As UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, I did a visit to the United Kingdom in 2018. And the UK basically, I mean, the UK started in 2010 when it introduced its austerity policy. It obviously started from a much better place than South Africa is in right now. But it nonetheless announced in the same way that now is the time for austerity. Now is the time to cut back. Now is the time to reduce government programs. And again, the government did an excellent job. They reduced money provided to local councils by about 50%, thus cutting out a huge array of services that had been provided to communities around the country. They undertook major benefit reform, which reduced the scale of benefits available, which eliminated a lot of people from the overall rolls, introduced forms of conditionality, which were very demanding, and introduced sanctions that were extraordinarily punitive, essentially reversing the role where the individual suddenly was accountable rather than the state. And the results were utterly predictable and not at odds with what the government, in fact, wanted. Poverty increased dramatically. Life expectancy for certain key groups stalled and then regressed. The number of people living in what was officially called destitution was immense. And the number of children who were living in poverty was getting up to above 1/3 of the whole population. And the consequences have been tragic. The explosion of food banks where before there had been none, and a really grim situation for many millions of people in the UK. But the economy has thrived. The rich have got much richer. Inequality has grown. The key point in some ways, of course, is that the UK government actually changed its policy when Boris Johnson came in and COVID hit very soon after. And now a lot of the austerity, which caused such immense pain, has suddenly gone out the window. Not that the resources are being directed towards the plight of the worst off, but the government is no longer talking about the absolute need for budgetary restraint and so on, which in my view and in the terms that I used in the report demonstrated pretty clearly that the austerity that was imposed was not actually driven by economic necessity or even economic analysis, but by ideology. And I have to say to you, I think that is a key point in the South African context, that to the extent that there is an ideology underlying the measures that have been outlined today by Duma and Busi, those are not being driven by the economic policy prescriptions that are currently subscribed to by most of the key international actors. South Africa seems to be actually operating in a time warp. It seems that the government is saying, oh, we missed out on the harshest part of neoliberalism 10 years ago. Now's the time to catch up. And yet, bizarrely, the rest of the world is now moving fairly systematically in a quite different direction. So you get, for example, the International Monetary Fund, which is not an agency that I'm particularly fond of. It's an agency whose actual prescriptions continue to be very problematic for the vast majority of countries. But if you look at its latest flagship report, the Fiscal Monitor, which came out earlier this month, it's all about the importance of pre-distribution and redistribution. Pre-distribution meaning setting up the economy in such a way that there is effective distribution through access to resources across the board, and redistribution meaning that taxes do have to be raised on the wealthy, meaning that money does have to be redistributed to the least well off. Not in their case as a matter of human rights, because they dismiss human rights as a complete irrelevance, but simply as a matter of economic policy. In other words, the IMF would say that the policy that is now being announced by the South African government is self-defeating and counterproductive if there is any interest in stimulating economic growth in a serious way. But it would seem to me, from all that has been said, that that's not the objective. The objective is an ideological one, to entrench the private sector even further, to shrink the government to the greatest extent possible. That brings me to my final point, which is, what should the human rights community do? And while I think traditionally the Constitution and the Constitutional Court have played very important roles in South Africa, we also need to be reflecting on the role of other actors, because the deeper change of heart is not going to come through the courts, just as it will not come through the private sector. There needs to be a real commitment to economic and social rights ideologically as requiring a fundamental and deep-seated redistribution of resources, which has never happened in South Africa since the fall of apartheid. And we know that the apartheid system was designed to precisely do the opposite. So South Africa is well behind the curve in this area. I think it's really important then for human rights groups, for example, to tackle the issue of privatization. This is something that I'm actually working on now, because I'm convinced that globally it is actually a central issue. The private sector has a very important role. No one's questioning that. But the private sector is never in any country going to be able to play the role that government must play in terms of the provision of public goods. The private sector is never going to occupy itself with the poorest 20 or 30% of the population, because there's no money in them. And if governments don't do it, you're not stimulating the economy. You're not ensuring that the workforce is going to be better educated, that children are going to be better nourished, and that the society is going to have a brighter future. So it's really essential, I think, for the different human rights groups to start reaching out to some of those who have made presentations today, and to a broader coalition, to work out how this can be exposed as a completely losing proposition in terms of the current budgetary strategy. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you.
Great. Thank you so much, Philip. And I think that's all the time we have this afternoon for this webinar. And I will just re-emphasize that the questions and comments that have been posted on our social media pages, as well as on the live chat, will be recorded and will be answered. And we will have a follow-up session or for discussion, as well as in the report and the answering of the questions. So for each speaker that has been directed a question, you will get those questions and will be awarded the opportunity to respond and to engage with that discussion. And I will now hand over to Isabel to just wrap up this webinar for us and to have a clear conclusion as to this platform, and a special thank you to the different panelists and to all the speakers. Thank you so much for your time and for your presentations, and for just giving us some very thought-provoking thoughts this afternoon. And a special shout out, of course, to our Facebook audience. Thank you so much for joining us and for commenting and for engaging in this wonderful discussion. And thank you all for those who joined on Zoom, as well as who tweeted and who were involved in the discussions. Thank you so much. And that is me. And for my duties, over to you, Isabel.
Thank you so much, Lalona. We just have an internal joke about Lalona's attempts at being a DJ and her shout outs to her Facebook fans. So that was the mirth from our side. I do want to thank everybody so much for participating, for being present, for giving up of your time. I think that the conversations that we've had here and the expertise lent to us by people on the panel should be of the caliber that enable us to start talking with a different narrative. We're very, very pleased to have members of the executive, as I said, and of the legislature, and members of sitting judiciary benches as well. But it's civil society and it's the media, it's all of us who need to be coming forward and saying, as Philip has just concluded, that what is going on is not something which is designing the society that we want to have going forward. So taking back the power which is meant to be in our hands and saying that the economy is meant to work for society, that the welfare of ordinary people is what is meant to drive the decisions. We as SPI are very, very pleased that we've been able to hold this conversation together. And we believe going forward, both in terms of the promotion of information and the analysis that we can do, as well as reaching out and forming networks with other people, coming down possibly to the National Assembly and briefing some of the committees on this information. We think that if we don't start having this conversation, that the kinds of orthodoxies that run national treasury are going to be the ones that run our democracy into the ground. So I would like to thank you for coming. As Lalona has said, the report will be available. In fact, it has been emailed out. It's a not final draft version. It's not the absolute final version. We'll capture the comments and questions in the final version. So I think what for Duma and I started out as a journey looking at the stimulus package enabled us to see with fresh eyes the fact that the crisis before the crisis is what is going to be with us going forward. And we hope that you found this a very useful time. Thank you, and thank you to Buzz and to everybody from SPI who has done so much in putting this together. Thanks.